Every month, the deck building site Archidekt holds a deck building contest, and for the month of August, the prompt was to build a beginner deck, bidding for someone to learn the EDH format or the game of Magic with. This is a great prompt, since many of the decks built on the site are not exactly made for newer players. For my submission to this contest, I made a red-green ramp deck. Its game plan is simple. Play a tap land on turn 1, a 2-mana dork on turn 2 to ramp out the deck's commander, Grand Warlord Rada, on turn 3, and then use her to generate mana to play a 5 or 6 drop as early as turn 4. Continue to attack for damage to generate mana, and play even bigger creatures which act as card draw, removal, or which threaten to close out the game on their own. As I finished the deck and started playtesting it against my friends' decks, I thought it was in a great spot for the contest. It was simple, encouraged players to sequence their plays, and taught them about one of the most important phases in Magic, the post-combat main phase. The deck had a few red flags, some by design, and others as a byproduct of my creative choices. Since the deck was nearly all creatures, it had no instant speed interaction. Because of this, the deck fails to teach new players about the stack, arguably the most important zone in Commander. The deck is also fairly weak, partly because of the budget limit of $40 I placed on it, as well as my intent to use slightly weaker versions of some cards to keep the power level of the deck intentionally low. My reason for this is that new players don't want to play against highly optimized decks when they sit down for their first couple games of Commander. Plus, it let me explore the deep trenches of Scryfall, looking for new cards I had never seen before and had never thought to use in a stompy deck. As I tested the deck, figured out its strengths and weaknesses, made my final changes, and shipped it off into the challenge submissions, I thought it would be really cool if there were 3 more decks like it, that new players could use to learn about the Commander format. So that's what I set out to make. I knew I wanted the decks to have different colors, and to keep with the theme of the first deck, I opted to use the killed color pairs. From there, I wanted all of the decks to have different game plans. I knew that the most simple way to win a game of Commander was through combat damage, so each of the 4 decks would have that same win condition, but they would all go about it in a different way. I also wanted the decks to be balanced against each other and play at a similar pace. It always sucks to sit down at what's supposed to be a casual game, only for turn 1 soul rings, game warping cards, and infinite combos to ruin the fun. Lastly, the decks all had to be simple and affordable for people who may be playing their very first game of Magic. So there's a total of 6 conditions. Be different 2-color decks, have different game plans, win via primarily combat damage, be balanced against each other, be simple, and be cheap. Sounds easy enough. The first list I made was a Dimir control list, with a tribal theme to round out the deck. I originally built the deck around Vren the Relentless, a rat tribal plus removal focused deck seeking to flood the boards with rats while killing creatures with its own removal spells. But I quickly realized that Vren's ability to turn any creature death into a relentless rat was incredibly unbalanced. These creature deaths included those killed by the removal spells I filled the deck with, and the many creatures that died each turn due to combat damage. In a pod built around decks focused on attacking with creatures, this was incredibly overpowered. After a bit of searching, I ended up settling on Anawan the Ruin Thief, who honestly felt like a better commander for the deck than Vren did. While Vren provides bodies to advance the combat damage win condition, Anawan provides card advantage to continue the control game plan, while also buffing our team of evasive rogues to help close out the game a little faster. I followed it up with an Izzet Spellslinger list, with Balmor, Battle Mage Captain, as the commander. I wanted this deck to play out a few creatures, make lots of tokens, and curate its hand with 1/1 card draw to have an explosive turn where it won off an absurd amount of Balmor triggers. This did not work as well as I thought it would, mainly because of how slow the deck had to play up until its big turn. I ended up swapping Balmor out for Jori N, as she offers consistent card advantage while also giving players an excuse to cast their draw spells early, rather than save them till the end of the game. The deck is also more focused on consistent value than the original Balmor list, packing more sources of card advantage in addition to its commander. The third deck I made was a Golgari Self-Mill/Reanimator list, with Kaga Shadow Archdruid as the commander. At first I thought Old Stick Fingers would fit the list just fine, but it ended up falling flat on its face while goldfishing, since it couldn't generate consistent turn-to-turn value without one of the specific effects from the 99, namely Kaga. After changing out the commanders and tweaking the number of cards in each category to include more permanents, the deck felt pretty good. It could mill itself each turn, generate value off of Kaga's static ability, and reanimate some pretty ridiculous threats to close out the game. The 4 decks all do wildly different things, though each has to be balanced against the other 3, otherwise it wouldn't make sense to play them in the same pot of decks. I enlisted the help of my playgroup, and we tested the decks against each other a total of 3 times. Each time we tested the decks, I made tweaks to iron out the issues in them. With each change I made, I had to ask myself a few questions. How will this change impact the other lists? Am I okay with this type of impact? And what kind of changes will I have to make to the other decks as a response? One of the hardest things I had to balance around were board wipes. Board wipes are an incredibly important part of Commander, as it allows decks that are behind to level the playing field and start fresh, to potentially salvage a win. Since these 4 decks are primarily built around creatures, I knew that any board wipe played would kneecap all of the decks, and because of this, I chose to include board wipes that are either kind of mid, or synergize neatly with the list that plays it. I also didn't want the decks to run too many board wipes, as having a lot of wipes in one game could discourage new players and ruin their play experience. The board wipes I decided to include in these decks are Mizzium Mortars, Terratide, Tegwil Scouring, Ryusei the Falling Star, and Incinerator of the Guilty. The Izzet list runs Mizzium Mortars. It's a fine removal spell, as it can kill any of the opposing 3 commanders, and can remove any of the smaller creatures contained in the 3 decks. However, when it comes to being a board wipe, the card is just okay. What I mean by that is, it doesn't really kill creatures that matter. When you board wipe, you're probably doing it because the Gruul player has a lot of huge threats, or the Golgari player has reanimated some pretty scary things. But more likely than not, Mizzium Mortars isn't going to be good against these kinds of threats. I put it inside the Izzet list mainly to serve as early turn removal to disrupt the other decks, or as a way to wipe away the smaller creatures from the Golgari and Dimir lists. On the other hand, Terratide is insane against the other 3 decks, especially when it's used in a deck looking to mill a lot of permanent cards. The main reason that the mill deck has Terratide instead of a much worse board wipe is because it is one of the slower, more grindy decks that doesn't care too much if its own creatures die. It makes sense for this deck to run a board wipe that kills all the creatures on the board, because it helps that deck stay alive long enough to reanimate its threats. This board wipe also happens to synergize with the deck really well, and has a built-in limiting factor that the deck already has to have milled so many permanent cards in order to get the best effect out of it. In the same vein, the rogue deck gets Tegwil's Scouring, an instant speed board wipe that even gives you back a few evasive rogues to recover. I opted to include this board wipe because again it synergizes nicely with what the deck wants to do, but also because it forces the player to choose between casting it and losing all their evasive rogues with good extra abilities, or holding it and potentially taking lots of damage from the other players. As for the Gruul deck, both board wipes are tied to creatures dying or dealing combat damage, which is why I opted to include 2 of them. Ryusei, like Mizzium Mortars, won't kill every creature, but it is enough to wipe away a lot of the smaller creatures that the Dimir and Izzet decks might be storing up. Incinerator of the Guilty only wipes away one player's board, so if there are more than one problem player, the Rada player has to use good threat assessment to pick the player who is most threatening to them. I ended up doing a lot of the balancing in this way, picking a card that synergizes well with a given deck, and then assessing how it would impact its home deck and the other 3 lists. In addition to board wipes, there were a few more things I needed to balance among the 4 decks. These include counterspells, targeted removal, game-ending threats, and graveyard hate. For counterspells, there are only 2 decks that run them. They are mostly concentrated in the Izzet list, though the Dimir list also runs a few counterspells that synergize with its mill subtheme. Most of the counterspells are meant to directly answer problems that those decks have in the other lists. For example, Disdainful Strokes serves as a catch-some answer to the higher mana curves of the Gruul and Golgari lists, while also acting as an early answer to each other commander and some of the more mana-intensive spells in the Dimir deck. Likewise, Drown in the Loch is a catch-all counterspell, but only if the Dimir deck has attacked enough times to fill its opponent's graveyards. Each of the decks has removal in some way. The deck with the most removal is the Dimir Rogues list, and the least is the Golgari Mill list. While the Dimir deck runs lots of removal pieces that are generically good cards, the other lists focus mainly on cards that synergize with their overall game plan. The Gruul list runs creatures that have enter the battlefield effects to fight or destroy opponents' things. The Izzet list runs low-cost, direct damage effects to trip up its opponents early on, and Golgari list runs a few permanent cards it can play from its yard with Kaga's ability, or to reanimate later on. As for game-ending threats, each deck has to end the game somehow, so they all have them. While the Golgari and Gruul decks both rely on board presence and hard-hitting creatures to close out the game, the Dimir deck seeks to get incremental damage over the course of a game, and the Izzet deck likes to win in a few bursts of damage off the backs of its cheap spells and high density of card advantage. Each of these strategies has their own upsides and downsides. Since the Dimir deck is built around primarily evasive creatures, it will always deal consistent chip damage turn after turn. The Izzet deck is much more explosive than the other lists, since it has many creatures that grow in power as it casts spells during its turn. The Gruul and Golgari decks' consistently big creatures are the most simple, since they don't often pump their creatures, and the only thing that's stopping them from getting in combat damage is the presence of chump blockers. Finally, Graveyard Hate. Each of the decks have some form of recursion built in, and Graveyard Hate serves as the answer to this, though its main purpose is to disrupt the Golgari and Dimir decks, which rely heavily on reanimation as a way to generate value over the course of the game. The Gruul and Izzet decks both have a copy of Scavenger Grounds, while the Golgari and Dimir decks both run Bojuka Bog. Notably, the Dimir deck also has a copy of Soul Guide Lantern, to exile each opponent's graveyard after they have milled enough. I am confident that I have arrived at a well-balanced, easy-to-understand set of decks that are fit for beginner Commander players to try out. If you'd like to give these lists a try, you can find a link to a folder containing all 4 of them in the description. Also, if you're interested in more lists like these, let me know in the comments down below. I'm definitely open to rounding out these decks to encompass all 10 guild colors, so that players can pick and choose the color pair that most interests them. If you'd like to see the decks I play against my friends when we're not testing $40 budget beginner decks, consider checking out my other videos. Thank you for watching.